before the tourists arrive, before the tour guides assemble their groups at the foot of the Old Town Bridge Tower, before the first coffee shop on Mala Strana pulls back its shutters. Prague belongs to the river. The Vltava moves through the city in the early morning the way it has moved for 10,000 years, brown and quiet and indifferent to everything built along its banks. The castle on the hill above catches the first light. Charles Bridge emerges from the mist, its 30 Baroque statues standing in the half-dark the way they have stood for 3 centuries, watching the water move below them. This city has been here for over 1,000 years. It has been the capital of a medieval empire, a centre of European science, a place where people were burned at stakes and executed in public squares and occupied by foreign armies across 4 different centuries. It has been silenced and it has spoken. It has lost entire communities to murder and exile and found a way to remain itself through all of it. The most beautiful things about Prague are inseparable from the darkest things about Prague. Understanding one requires understanding the other. This is that story. Let's go back to where it started. Chapter 1. The Hill Above the River. On a morning in the 6th century after the birth of Christ, if you had stood on a rocky hill above a bend in the Vltava River and looked out at what surrounded you, you would have understood immediately why people kept coming back to this particular place. The hill was steep on 3 sides. The 4th side sloped toward the river. Below, the water curved in a long arc through a valley of forests and marshland, and at the point directly beneath the hill, the river narrowed enough to cross. Not easily, not safely, but possible in a way. It was not for miles in either direction. From the top of the hill you could see everything approaching from every direction. You could not be surprised. Geography does not create cities, but it selects the locations where cities become possible. And this particular combination, a defensible hill, a crossable river, a fertile valley on both banks, was the kind of combination that, once people recognized it, tended to hold them. The first people to recognize it were not the ones who built the city you know today. The Celts arrived in the Bohemian Basin, the broad, fertile bowl of land that is now the Czech Republic, somewhere around the 4th and 5th centuries before the birth of Christ. One particular Celtic tribe, the Boii, settled so thoroughly in this region that the land itself eventually took their name. The Roman writers who came later called the territory Boeohamum. That word, passed through enough centuries and enough languages, became Bohemia. The Boii were skilled metal workers and traders. Archaeological excavations conducted by Czech researchers at sites throughout the Vltava Valley. Work documented in detail by the Czech archaeologist Ivan Borkovsky, whose excavations at Prague Castle Hill in the mid-20th century established much of what we know about early settlement there, have recovered coins, weapons, fragments of pottery, and traces of fortified hilltop settlements called oppida from this period. The Boii knew this landscape. They used its advantages, but they did not build a city here. The Romans came to Bohemia too, though they never incorporated it into the empire the way they did Gaul or Britain. The historian Tacitus documented Roman military probes into the territory. Roman goods reached Boii settlements through trade networks whose reach has been traced in the material record. But Bohemia sat at the edge of the Roman world, absorbing its influence without ever becoming part of its structure. That relationship with a larger power, close enough to be shaped by it, far enough to remain distinct, would become a pattern that defined Czech history for 2,000 years. It was already visible in the 1st century. It would still be visible in the 20th. By the time the Roman Empire began its long collapse, New groups were moving through the Bohemian Basin in the great migrations that reshaped Europe after Rome. Goths, Huns, Germanic tribes pushing in every direction. The hill above the river bend was occupied and abandoned, and occupied again by people who left traces in the soil, but not in the written record. The people who finally came to stay were the Slavs. Slavic tribes began moving into Bohemia sometime in the 6th century. The broad consensus among historians points to origins somewhere in the river valleys of what is now Ukraine and Poland, from which Slavic-speaking groups spread across an enormous territory in the centuries after Rome's collapse. By the late 500s and early 600s, Slavic communities were established throughout the Bohemian Basin, farming the river valleys, building timber settlements, and gradually developing the social structures that would eventually produce kingdoms and dynasties. What the archaeology tells us is a picture of small agricultural communities growing in complexity generation by generation. Borkowski's excavations found traces of early Slavic settlement on and around what would become Prague Castle Hill, dating to at least the 7th and 8th centuries. The location was doing exactly what geography had designed it to do. It was pulling people toward it, and sometime in the 8th or early 9th century, a Slavic tribal group began building a fortified settlement on that hill, with enough permanence and enough scale to suggest they intended to stay. These were the Czechs, not yet a kingdom, not yet a dynasty, not yet a name that anyone outside Bohemia would have recognized, but a people taking hold of a place in a way that would not be reversed. To understand what they were building, you need to understand the world pressing in around Bohemia in this period. From the west, the Frankish Empire that Charlemagne had built, now fracturing among his heirs but still formidable, still carrying the cultural and religious force that had reorganized most of Western Europe. From the south and east, the great Moravian Empire, a Slavic kingdom whose trajectory would intersect with Bohemia's in ways that no one could yet predict. From the open steppes further east, periodic raids by nomadic peoples that could devastate entire regions in weeks. The hilltop settlement above the Vltava sat at the intersection of all these pressures, not on the edge of anything, slowly, not yet dramatically, becoming a center. The family that emerged to lead the Czech tribes from this hilltop came from an origin story where legend and history are so thoroughly mixed that separating them entirely is probably the wrong ambition. The historian Cosmas of Prague, writing in the early 12th century in his Chronica Boemorum, the earliest systematic chronicle of Bohemian history we possess, recorded the founding legends of the Přemyslid dynasty while making clear he understood their legendary character. The legends say the dynasty began with a ploughman chosen by a visionary princess named Libuse, who stood on the hill above the river and described the great city that would rise there. What Cosmas documented alongside the legends is that by the 9th century, a family exercising leadership over a significant portion of the Bohemian Slavic tribes was established at the hill above the Vltava. The first Přemyslid ruler whose existence we can say with real confidence is Bořivoj I, who appears in historical records in the 800s as the prince controlling the fortified settlement that was becoming Prague Castle. Bořivoj I would make a decision that changed Bohemia forever. But to understand that decision, you need to understand what it meant to make it, and that belongs to the next chapter. For now, see what he saw: a river valley spreading out below, a crossing that could be controlled, a landscape that could be farmed and defended, a position from which a person with enough authority and enough intelligence could reach every direction at once. It was not yet a city, but it was already, unmistakably, a place. Chapter 2. The Castle on the Cliff. Bořivoj I was a Slavic chieftain in his 20s or early 30s, ruling a fortified hilltop settlement that was significant by local standards but unknown to the wider world. His castle, if you could call it that yet, was timber and earthwork, not stone. His court was small, his territory was modest, but Bořivoj was paying attention to the right things. The great power pressing in from the west was the Frankish Empire, carrying with it the cultural and religious force that had reorganized most of Western Europe in the preceding century, Christianity, and the ruler of the neighboring Great Moravian Empire, controlling the most powerful Slavic state in Central Europe, had been navigating a careful relationship with both the Franks and the Byzantine Church to the south, trying to preserve Moravian independence by playing one great power against another. It was in the court of the Moravian ruler, around the year 883 by the dating most historians accept, that Bořivoj encountered the man who would redirect everything. His name was Methodius. Methodius was a Byzantine missionary, one half of the pair of brothers, Cyril and Methodius, whom the Byzantine emperor had sent to Moravia in 863 to bring a Christianity that spoke Slavic rather than the Latin of the Frankish clergy. Cyril, the younger and more intellectually brilliant of the two, had created an alphabet specifically designed to write the Slavic language, the ancestor of the Cyrillic script that Russia and Bulgaria and Serbia still use today. Cyril died in Rome in 869, but Methodius continued the mission in Moravia for another 15 years. The Life of Methodius, a 9th century Slavic text that is one of our primary sources for this period, records his baptism of the Bohemian prince in careful detail. When Bořivoj came to the Moravian court, Methodius baptized him. The core fact appears in enough independent sources, including the Christian legend and the chronicles of Cosmas, to be treated as historical. The Přemyslid Prince of Bohemia returned to his hilltop settlement a different kind of ruler than he had left. Conversion was not a simple spiritual event in the 9th century. It was a political realignment of the First Order. To accept baptism was to enter a network of obligations, alliance, and legitimacies that touched everything from how you treated neighboring rulers to how your people buried their dead. The Frankish Church wanted Bohemia in its sphere. The Byzantines had their own ambitions. The pagan nobility of the Czech tribes had no desire to be reorganized by a foreign religion brought home by their own prince. Bořivoj faced immediate resistance. The chronicles describe a revolt by Czech nobles who drove him temporarily from his seat of power. He returned with Moravian support and re-established his authority. Then he built a church. The first Christian church in Bohemia was constructed at Prague Castle, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, probably before 885. It was small. It was built of wood. None of it survives in any visible form today. But the act of building it on the castle hill was a declaration. The hilltop above the Vltava River was not just a military position now. It was a sacred one. And the two things together, the castle and the church, on the same rocky promontory overlooking the river, established a relationship between spiritual and political authority that would define Prague for the next 1,000 years. Bořivoj died young, probably in his mid-30s, around 889. He left behind a wife named Ludmila, who had been baptized with him, and a legacy more fragile than it appeared. The next generation would produce both a saint and an act of violence that Bohemia is still carrying. Bořivoj's grandson was born around the year 907. His Czech name was Václav. You may know him by the anglicized version, Wenceslas, from a Christmas carol that most English-speaking people know, without knowing anything about the man it describes. The Carol, written in 1849 by the English hymn writer John Mason Neale, involves a king walking through snow to bring charity to a poor man. It is a charming story of Christmas generosity. The real Vaclav was something considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. He came to power in Bohemia after his father Vratislav I died around 921. Vaclav was at that point probably in his early to mid-teens, young enough that his mother Drahomira initially held significant influence over the court. His grandmother Ludmila, deeply committed to the Christian formation of the young prince, was a countervailing force. The tension between the two women became, within months of Vratislav's death, something worse than tension. In 921, Drahomira had Ludmila strangled by her own servants at Tetin Castle. It was one of the earliest political murders in recorded Czech history, and it set the emotional context for everything that followed in Vaclav's reign. A prince, Vaclav pursued a policy that prioritized Christian authority in Bohemia and a careful management of the relationship with the dominant external power of the age, the Saxon king Henry I, and later his son Otto, who would become the first Holy Roman Emperor. Vaclav paid tribute to Henry. He built the rotunda of St. Vitus on Prague Castle Hill, the direct ancestor of the great cathedral that stands there today. The chronicler Widukind of Corvey, writing in the 10th century, documented Vaclav's relationship with the Saxon court as a genuine political alliance built on mutual benefit rather than simple submission. His pagan nobles hated him for it. To them, the tribute was humiliation. The deference to Saxon power was surrender. The Christian reorganization of Bohemian society was an attack on the old ways that had sustained their authority. They found their leader in Vaclav's own younger brother. His name was Boleslav. History has called him Boleslav the Cruel, and the name was earned. On the 28th of September, 935, Boleslav invited his brother to a feast at his settlement in Stara Boleslav, about 15 miles northeast of Prague. The following morning, after prayers, Boleslav and his companions attacked Vaclav. The prince resisted, strongly enough that he briefly threw his brother to the ground. Then Boleslav's men joined the fight. Vaclav was killed at the door of the church. He was in his late 20s. Within years of his death, Vaclav was being venerated as a martyr and a saint. Within decades, his cult had spread beyond Bohemia. He is the patron saint of the Czech lands to this day, which means that a man murdered by his own brother at a church door in 935 is still present in the identity of a modern European nation 11 centuries later. Think about what that continuity means. The founding trauma of Czech national identity was not a defeat in battle or a natural disaster. It was a betrayal by someone who should have been the closest ally. The good man destroyed by practical power. Idealism sacrificed to political reality. That pattern, established in blood on a September morning in 935, would replay itself across the next 11 centuries with a consistency that is either coincidence or something built into the character of this particular place. Boleslav the Cruel ruled Bohemia for over 30 years and was, by most measures, effective. He expanded Bohemian territory, centralized authority, and eventually embraced the same Christianity he had murdered his brother over, because the political mathematics of the region left him no alternative. He was pragmatic in the way that survivors of power struggles tend to become. The Přemyslid dynasty continued after Boleslav. His son secured the establishment of the Prague bishopric in 973. making the city an official centre of the Church in Central Europe. The castle grew. The settlement below it grew. The crossing, that had always been the reason for this location, now served a community large enough to be called, tentatively, a town. But the hill, the castle, the church, the martyr saint, and the murder at the church door were now all in place. Prague was not yet the city it would become, but it had already found the particular combination of beauty and darkness that would define it forever. Chapter 3. The Golden City. Walk across Charles Bridge today, and you are walking on one of the most photographed stretches of stone in the world. The 30 Baroque statues lining the parapets, the castle on the hill above, the river below in its permanent brown-green, street musicians competing for the same tourists who are competing for the same photographs. Most people on that bridge know it is old. Very few know that the man who ordered it built was one of the most powerful rulers in the history of Europe, that Prague in his time was among the largest cities on the continent, and that the decisions he made across the mid-14th century are the reason this city looks the way it does today. His name was Karol IV. The world knows him as Charles IV. And to understand what he did to Prague, you have to first understand what Prague was before he arrived, and the strange chain of violence and inheritance that brought him to it. The Přemyslid dynasty had carried Bohemia from a tribal territory to a kingdom through the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. By the early 1300s, the city had, perhaps, 30,000 inhabitants, significant but not exceptional by European standards. And then the Přemyslid male line died out. The last Přemyslid king, Václav III, was stabbed to death in 1306. He was 16 years old and had been king for less than a year. With his death, the dynasty that had ruled Bohemia for 4 centuries ended in a moment of violence, which tells you something consistent about how Czech history tends to move. After a complicated sequence of marriages and inheritance claims, the Bohemian throne passed to a German noble family called the Luxembourgs. The first Luxembourg king of Bohemia, John the Blind, died at the Battle of Crécy in 1346 fighting alongside the French, reportedly asking his knights to lead him into the thickest fighting so he could strike at least one blow despite his total blindness. His device of 3 feathers and the motto Ich dien, meaning I serve, was adopted by the English Black Prince, who found his body on the battlefield and has been carried by the Prince of Wales ever since. Whether you have ever seen that symbol before today, you were looking at a piece of Bohemian history without knowing it. But John the Blind was rarely in Bohemia. His son was the opposite. Karol was born in Prague in 1316, the son of John the Blind and a Bohemian princess named Eliska Přemyslovna, which gave him blood ties to the old dynasty. He was sent as a child to be educated at the French royal court, where he became fluent in 5 languages and absorbed the culture of the most sophisticated court in Western Europe. He returned to Bohemia as a young man and was appalled by what he found. Bohemia had been neglected. Prague had been allowed to stagnate. He decided to change that, with an energy and a systematic intelligence that neither his father nor any of his predecessors had brought to the task. In the summer of 1346, Karol was elected King of the Romans, the title held by the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire before formal coronation by the Pope. That election took place in Frankfurt in July. Weeks later, in August of the same year, his father John the Blind was killed at the Battle of Crécy, and Karol became King of Bohemia as well. 9 years after that, in 1355, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Innocent VI in Rome. The The combination placed him at the peak of European political authority. He was simultaneously the king of one of the wealthiest kingdoms in Europe and the elected head of the largest political entity on the continent. And he chose Prague as his imperial seat. What followed was one of the most concentrated bursts of urban construction in medieval European history. In 1348, Karol founded the new town of Prague, a planned urban extension south and east of the existing city that was larger than the original settlement it was built beside. He laid out the streets himself. According to multiple chroniclers of his reign, including Beneš Krabice of Weitmile, who documented the reign of Charles IV in detail, and whose chronicle is preserved in the National Museum in Prague. The new town was designed with the kind of systematic ambition that reminds you of what Haussmann did to Paris 5 centuries later, except that Karol was building new space rather than demolishing existing neighborhoods. In the same year, 1348, he founded Charles University. It was the first university in Central Europe. When Karol signed the founding charter in April of 1348, he created an institution that has been operating continuously for nearly 700 years. The faculty he recruited came from Paris, from Bologna, from Oxford. Prague was not just becoming an imperial seat, it was becoming a centre of European intellectual life. Then came the bridge. The previous stone crossing over the Vltava had been destroyed by a flood in 1342. Karol ordered a new one. Construction began on the 9th of July, 1357. The date was not chosen casually. According to Beneš Krabice of Weitmile, the date was selected because it forms a numerological palindrome. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 7, 5, 3, 1. Considered auspicious for the permanence of the structure. The bridge has stood for more than 660 years. Whatever you think about numerology, the construction worked. At 16 spans and nearly a third of a mile in length, it was one of the longest stone bridges in Europe at the time of its completion. Karol did not live to see the Baroque statues that would eventually line its parapets. Those came in the 17th and 18th centuries. But the bridge he built, the stone he chose, the placement he ordered, is the structure that tourists cross today and that the street musicians play beside, and that the early morning light hits the same way it has hit for 6.5 centuries. Under Karol's reign, contemporary accounts, including those of the Italian chronicler Giovanni da Marignola, who spent years at the Bohemian court and documented its life in detail, describe a city of extraordinary wealth and diversity. Merchants from Venice and Nuremberg, scholars from Paris and Krakow, Jewish traders and financiers whose community in Prague was among the largest and most established in Central Europe. St. Vitus Cathedral, the great Gothic structure at the heart of Prague Castle, was begun under Karol and has his tomb at its centre. He is buried there still, beneath stone. In the city he remade. The cathedral was not completed until the early 20th century, nearly 600 years after he laid its foundations. Stop and think about what that actually means. The people who broke the first ground for St. Vitus Cathedral in 1344 knew with certainty that they would not live to see it finished. Their children would not live to see it finished. Their grandchildren would not live to see it finished. Multiple generations of workers, stone carvers, glaziers, and architects would give their working lives to a building that none of them would ever see complete. And they built it anyway, with the same precision and the same ambition they would have brought to a project they expected to see finished in their own lifetimes. That is a different relationship with time than most of us have, a different relationship with legacy. and it produced one of the great buildings of European civilization, which now stands finished above the city that Carroll remade, containing his tomb at its centre, surrounding his bones with the stone that 7 centuries of hands put in place above him. Carroll IV died in 1378 after a reign of 32 years. He had given Prague its university, its greatest bridge, its new town, its identity as an imperial seat, and a physical scale that would make it one of the dominant cities of Europe for the next generation. He had also, perhaps without entirely understanding it, given it something less visible and more dangerous. He had made Prague a place where ideas circulated freely, where the tensions between different intellectual and religious traditions could be argued in the open, and among the students and faculty at the university he had founded, a professor and preacher was developing ideas about the church and its corruption that would eventually cost him his life at a bonfire in a German city, and ignite a war that consumed Central Europe for a generation. His name was Jan Hus, and what happened to him is one of the darkest chapters in Prague's long history of darkness. Chapter 4. The Preacher and the Fire. There is a square in the centre of Prague called Old Town Square. Today it is full of tourists. They photograph the astronomical clock on the hour. They eat at cafe tables that spill across the cobblestones. They buy souvenirs and take videos and move on to the next thing on their list. In the middle of that square, there is a large, dark monument. A figure stands at its centre, robed and severe, his back to the crowd, his face turned slightly upward. Most tourists walk past it without stopping. A few take photographs without knowing who it depicts. The figure is Jan Hus, and the ground around that monument is within a short distance. The ground where the ideas that would eventually split European Christianity were first preached to a city that was not yet sure it wanted to hear them. The story of Jan Hus does not begin with fire. It begins with a university lecture hall and a set of questions about money and power and truth that were, in the late 14th century, genuinely dangerous to ask out loud. Hus was born around 1369 in the small Bohemian town of Husinec. He came from modest circumstances, studied at Charles University, and by the early 1400s had risen to become its rector and the preacher at Bethlehem Chapel in the old town of Prague. Bethlehem Chapel was not a cathedral. It was a space designed specifically for preaching to large congregations in the Czech language, which was itself a statement. The formal language of the church was Latin. To preach in Czech was to say that ordinary people who did not read Latin and had no access to church documents, deserved to understand what was being said to them. That statement alone made powerful enemies. The ideas Hus was developing had roots in the writings of the English theologian John Wycliffe, who had died in 1384 after spending his career attacking the wealth and corruption of the institutional church. Wycliffe's writings had been declared heretical. His bones were later dug up and burned by church authorities who wanted to erase even his physical remains. But his ideas had travelled from England to Prague through the academic networks of Charles University, carried by Czech scholars who had studied in Oxford. Hus refined those ideas and gave them a voice, a location, and a congregation of thousands. He was a preacher of exceptional power, week after week. The chapel filled beyond its capacity. They came because he was addressing something real. Priests held multiple appointments and rarely appeared at any of them. High church offices were bought and sold openly. Indulgence, payments in exchange for remission of punishment for sins, were sold on a scale that had become a significant source of church revenue. The gap between what the church taught and how its officials lived was wide enough that anyone could see it clearly from the outside. Hus said so, from his pulpit, in Czech, to crowds of thousands, week after week, year after year. The Church's response was to summon him. The Council of Constance was convened beginning in 1414, partly to resolve a crisis that had left the Church with 3 simultaneous claimants to the papacy, and partly to address the theological challenges posed by Hus and others like him. Hus was invited to attend and present his views. He was promised safe conduct by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, a document that was supposed to guarantee his ability to travel to Constance, present his case, and return home safely, regardless of what the council concluded. He went. The promise of safe conduct was broken almost immediately. Hus was arrested on arrival and imprisoned. He was held for months in conditions that damaged his health seriously. He was brought before the council multiple times and asked to recant his teachings, to acknowledge that he had been wrong, to submit to the authority of the assembled church. He refused. The written record of his responses is preserved in the council minutes and in the account of his supporter Peter of Mladonovice, who was present throughout the proceedings and documented them with the precision of a man who understood he was watching something that would matter for a long time. What Mladonovice recorded shows a man making a specific and principled distinction. He was willing to be corrected if shown from Scripture that he was in error. He was not willing to say he was wrong simply because authority told him to. Stop and sit with that for a moment. A man sitting in a prison cell, knowing what refusal would cost him, choosing it anyway, not from stubbornness, not from pride, from a conviction that the difference between what he believed and what he was being told to say was not a technicality. It was everything. It was the difference between a life that meant something and a life that did not. On the 6th of July, 1415, Jan Hus was led out in front of the council wearing his vestments. They were stripped from him one by one, each item accompanied by a ritual curse. A paper crown painted with devils was placed on his head. He was declared a heretic and handed to the secular authorities for punishment, because the church could not execute him itself. It could only hand him to people who would. He was taken to a field outside Constance and burned alive. The account of Peter of Mladonovice, an eyewitness record of extraordinary detail preserved in multiple manuscript copies, records that Hus sang hymns as the fire was being built. When someone in the crowd brought more wood to pile around him, Hus is recorded as saying, in the Latin that Mladonovice transcribed Sancta Simplicitas, holy simplicity, a man being burned to death, noting with quiet observation the sincere intentions of his executioners. He died in the flames on the 6th of July, 1415. News reached Prague within days. What followed was not grief alone. It was fury. 452 Bohemian and Moravian nobles signed a letter to Constance, protesting the execution and declaring that Hus had been condemned without evidence and against every principle of justice. It was one of the most significant collective political acts in Bohemian history up to that point. It exploded on the 30th of July, 1419. A procession of Hussite supporters was moving through the new town of Prague. Some of their members had been imprisoned and held in the new town hall. The procession demanded their release. When stones were thrown at the marchers from the windows of the building, the crowd stormed it. The royal councillors inside were thrown through the windows. 7 officials died in the fall or were killed by the crowd below. This is the first defenestration of Prague, the first of what would become a recurring pattern in Czech history, a pattern so specific and so repeated that it became its own dark symbol. In 1419, it ignited a religious war. In 1618, it started the 30 Years' War. The window became, in the Czech historical imagination, the point where argument ends and history begins. The Hussite wars that followed lasted from 1419 to 1436 and were among the most destructive conflicts Central Europe had seen to that point. The movement had developed into a full theological and political program demanding that the Church reform itself. The most symbolically important demand was that ordinary people attending church be allowed to receive both the bread and the wine of communion. Not just the bread. The wine had been reserved for the clergy. The chalice became the symbol of the entire movement and is still the symbol of the Czech Church descended from this tradition today. The Pope called crusades against the Hussites. 5 separate crusades. All 5 were defeated. This is the part that most Western history education either skips or compresses into a sentence. The Hussite armies of Bohemia defeated 5 papally sponsored crusading armies. They did it partly through geography, partly through brilliant military innovation under a commander named Jan Žižka, whose development of wagon-based mobile fortifications has been studied by military historians as a significant precursor to later tactical thinking. Žižka lost one eye before the wars began, and his other eye to an arrow during the fighting. He continued commanding in complete blindness, directing battles through a chain of officers who described the terrain to him. He died in 1424 of plague rather than battle. He was never defeated in the field. The Hussite wars ended with a negotiated settlement. The Compacts of Basel in 1436, which granted the Bohemian Church specific rights, including the communion cup, in exchange for recognizing the authority of Rome in other matters. It was a compromise that satisfied almost no one but established a precedent. Bohemia would not simply be brought to heel by international church authority. That had been tried 5 times. 5 times it had failed. Jan Hus had been burned in 1415. The Protestant Reformation that Martin Luther launched in 1517 is usually taught as the beginning of the challenge to church authority in Europe. But Hus came first. He made the same arguments, a century earlier, from a pulpit in the old town of Prague, to crowds of thousands who understood exactly what he meant. Historians, including Thomas Fudge, whose comprehensive study of the Hussite period remains one of the standard English-language references on the subject, have documented extensively how Bohemia's religious revolution preceded and in many ways anticipated what Luther would later do. Hus died for it. Luther lived. That fact is not widely known outside the Czech lands. It should be. And now, in the generation after Hus, the dynasty that would hold Bohemia for nearly 4 centuries was about to arrive. It would come not through conquest but through invitation, and the people who extended that invitation would spend the next 300 years regretting it. Chapter 5. Empire and Unease. Picture a room in Bratislava in the summer of 1526. The leading men of Bohemia are assembled, and they are afraid. 6 weeks earlier, at a place called Mohacs in southern Hungary, the Ottoman army under Suleiman the Magnificent had destroyed the army of their king. The young Jagiellonian ruler Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia, so completely and so quickly that Louis himself had died in the rout, thrown from his horse crossing a stream while fleeing the battlefield. He was 20 years old. He had been king for less than a decade. He left no heirs. The Ottoman army was not stopping. It was moving north and west. The question in that room in Bratislava was not abstract. It was immediate. Who would defend Bohemia? And the answer the Bohemian estates arrived at, after weighing their options with the urgency of men who understood what was at stake, was Ferdinand of Habsburg, brother of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. who had a dynastic claim to the Bohemian throne through his marriage to Louis's sister. They elected Ferdinand as their king. They believed they were choosing a protector on their own terms, a king whose authority they were granting and could in principle constrain. What they had actually done was invite the most powerful dynasty in Europe into their house. The Habsburgs would not leave for nearly 400 years. Ferdinand ruled until 1564. The religious diversity that had made Bohemia distinctive since the Hussite settlement persisted through the early Habsburg period. Catholics, Utraquists following the Hussite tradition, Lutherans, various reform communities, all coexisting in a tension that was productive until it was not. The Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church's organized response to Protestantism, was gaining strength across Europe and putting increasing pressure on Habsburg rulers to reduce toleration and bring their territories back to doctrinal conformity. And then came Rudolf. Rudolf II became Holy Roman Emperor in 1576 and made Prague his imperial seat, a decision that transformed the city in ways that still shape its character today. Rudolf was not a conventional emperor. The Venetian ambassador Giovanni Dolfin, whose dispatches from Prague in the 1590s are preserved in the Venetian state archives, described a ruler gripped by deep melancholy, capable of withdrawing from the business of empire for weeks or months at a time, and driven by an intellectual curiosity so consuming that it left little room for the practical demands of governance. What Rudolf had, in extraordinary abundance, was the collector's instinct elevated to genius. The Kunstkammer he assembled at Prague Castle was unlike anything that existed anywhere in the world. Paintings by Dürer, by Bruegel, by Arcimboldo, whose extraordinary composite portrait heads, faces made of fruits and vegetables and fish, became so identified with Rudolf's court that they are inseparable from his image today. Scientific instruments of every description, objects from the Americas and the Ottoman East and Asia, natural history specimens, clocks of extraordinary mechanical complexity. Rudolf wanted to understand everything, and he attracted to Prague the minds most capable of helping him. Tycho Brahe arrived in Prague in 1599. He was the most precise observational astronomer in Europe before the telescope. A man who had spent decades on the Danish island of Hvaen, building instruments of extraordinary precision and accumulating data on planetary positions more accurate than anything previously recorded. He had lost the tip of his nose in a duel in his youth and wore a prosthetic of metal alloy. He was arrogant, difficult, and almost certainly the best observational data collector alive. Johannes Kepler arrived in Prague in 1600, drawn by the quality of Brahe's data and the patronage Rudolf's court could provide. The two men worked together in Prague, Brahe fiercely protective of his observations and Kepler hungry to use them for the mathematical theory he was developing. Their collaboration was productive and difficult in equal measure. When Brahe died in 1601, Kepler inherited the data and continued the work. Now stop for a moment and consider what happened next. From that Prague data, working in a city that most of the world had never heard of, Kepler derived the 3 laws of planetary motion that describe how the planets actually move around the Sun. He published the first 2 in Astronomia Nova in 1609, while still in Prague. These laws are the foundations on which Newton later built his theory of universal gravitation, which means the mathematical framework underlying every spacecraft trajectory, every satellite orbit, every space mission in human history, was worked out in Prague at the turn of the 17th century by 2 men, funded by an emperor who also practiced alchemy and kept a lion as a court pet. History moves in stranger paths than any straight line could capture. Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel, known in Jewish tradition as the Maharal of Prague, was a towering figure of Jewish scholarship in the late 16th century whose presence in Prague during this period is well documented, including a famous audience with Rudolf II, described in several contemporary sources. The legend of the golem, a figure of clay from the Vltava animated by a word of power to defend the Jewish community, became attached to his name in texts from the 19th century rather than the 16th. What matters is that the legend could only have grown in this specific Prague. In this moment when the emperor collected wonders, astronomers charted the stars, and alchemists hunted for gold in the same palace complex. The golem story is Prague's mythology expressing its own nature. A city that had been creating and destroying and recreating versions of itself for 700 years could recognize a story about a being made of local clay, animated by knowledge, and destroyed by the same hand that made it. Rudolf died in 1612, having been forced to abdicate effective power to his brother Matthias years before his death. His Kunstkammer was dispersed, much of it carried away by Swedish armies during the 30 Years' War that was already gathering on the horizon. The paintings are now in museums across Europe. The instruments are in collections in Vienna and Stockholm. But the work of the scientists Rudolf brought to the city left something more durable than any object in any museum. The planetary laws that Kepler published from Prague are in every physics textbook on Earth. And underneath all the wonder of Rudolf's Prague, the religious question had been postponed rather than answered. In 1589, Rudolf had issued a document called the Letter of Majesty, granting religious freedom to Bohemian Protestants, a real concession, won by sustained pressure from the Bohemian estates. But the Habsburg successors who came after him had no intention of honouring it permanently. The Counter-Reformation was advancing. The idea that a major Habsburg territory should remain religiously plural was becoming, to the most powerful forces in the Catholic world, not a policy to be maintained but a problem to be solved. The solution they chose would throw all of Europe into 30 years of war, and it would begin, as so many things in Prague's history began, with a window, but not before one more piece of the story fell into place. Because the men who would walk into the Bohemian Chancellery on the 23rd of May, 1618, were not acting in anger or in chaos. They were acting after years of failed legal appeals, broken promises, and the slow realization that the system they were working within had no intention of giving them what they had been guaranteed. Understanding what happened that morning requires understanding what had been taken from them, and for how long they had tried to get it back through proper channels before they finally ran out of channels. Chapter 6. The Window and the War. On the 23rd of May, 1618, 3 men were thrown out of a window. They fell from the 3rd floor of the Bohemian Chancellery at Prague Castle, a drop of roughly 16 metres. All 3 survived, which the Catholic side immediately declared a miracle, and which the Protestant side noted was more likely explained by the pile of debris at the bottom. The debate over whose interpretation was correct continued for years, and tells you everything you need to know about the religious atmosphere of the time. The 3 men were royal governors, officials of the Habsburg administration in Bohemia. The men who threw them were Bohemian Protestant nobles who had come to the castle that morning with a specific agenda. Protestant churches protected by Rudolf's Letter of Majesty were being closed on lands owned by the Catholic Church, in violation, the Protestants argued, of the document's terms. They had come to confront the governors. The confrontation had run out of room. Think about what was happening in that room in the minutes before it happened. Men who had exhausted every legal and diplomatic option available, who had presented their case through every proper channel and been ignored or overruled? Who had watched their religious freedom be dismantled document by document while the authorities told them the process was entirely legitimate? At some point, the argument stops being an argument. 3 men went through the window. That is how the 30 Years' War began. Within months, the Bohemian estates had declared the Habsburg emperor, deposed and elected a Protestant prince from the Rhineland, Friedrich V, as their new king. Friedrich was young, inexperienced, deeply Protestant by conviction, and almost completely misjudged the military and political situation he was walking into. The support of the Protestant princes of the German states he had been promised did not materialize quickly enough. The Habsburg response was organized and overwhelming. On the 8th of November, 1620, the 2 armies met at Bielahora, White Mountain, a low plateau just west of Prague. The battle lasted roughly 2 hours. The Bohemian and allied Protestant forces were routed completely. Friedrich fled Prague so quickly that he left his dinner half-eaten on the table, earning him the nickname the Winter King for the single season his reign lasted. The Battle of White Mountain rewrote an entire history in an afternoon. On the 21st of June, 1621, 27 Bohemian Protestant leaders were executed in Old Town Square. Today there are 27 white crosses embedded in the cobblestones near the astronomical clock, 1 for each man. Most tourists do not notice them, or notice them without knowing what they mark. If you visit that square, look down. The crosses are there, worn smooth by centuries of feet, but still there. The executions lasted several hours. The heads of the executed were displayed on the Tower Bridge over the Vltava River for 10 years. Stop there. 10 years. Not days. Not weeks. 10 years. Every person who crossed that bridge, every morning, for a decade, walked under the displayed heads of their Protestant leaders. That was not accidental. That was a message delivered every single day for 10 years to an entire population about the cost of resistance and the permanence of the new order. What followed was systematic in the way that only a determined institutional power with unlimited resources can be systematic. The Letter of Majesty granting religious freedom was publicly torn up by the emperor. Protestant nobles who had not been executed lost their estates, redistributed to loyal Catholic families from Austria, Spain, and Italy. The confiscations were so extensive that Bohemia's entire landowning class was essentially replaced within a decade. Czech was pushed out of official and elite life. Latin and German became the languages of administration, of the courts, of the institutions of power. Czech did not disappear. It survived in the countryside, in folk song, in the daily speech of people who had never stopped using it. But to speak Czech in an official context in 17th century Prague was to mark yourself as someone without access to the structures that mattered. And that distinction between the language of power and the language of the people is never merely a linguistic fact. It is a social fact with consequences that run through everything. The Jesuit order, the most intellectually formidable instrument of the Counter-Reformation, was installed as the dominant force in Bohemian education and public life. Bonfires of Protestant books were organized. Protestant pastors were expelled or forced to convert. The historian Peter Wilson, whose comprehensive study of the 30 Years' War published by Harvard University Press in 2009 remains one of the standard references on the period, documented the demographic consequences in detail. Estimates, based on the available evidence, suggest that Bohemia lost somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of its entire population in the period between 1618 and 1650, through a combination of warfare, famine, disease, and the deliberate expulsion of Protestant communities. Prague, which had approached the scale of a major European capital under Rudolf, shrank dramatically. Entire villages ceased to exist. And then, over the following decades, something visually extraordinary happened to the city that had been so thoroughly defeated. The Catholic Church and the new Catholic nobility, flush with confiscated wealth and determined to demonstrate the permanence of their victory, rebuilt Prague in Baroque. The swelling curves and theatrical drama and calculated emotional impact of Baroque architecture was, in the 17th century, explicitly the architecture of the Counter-Reformation. It was designed to overwhelm, to move people through their senses before their minds could engage, to make the authority and grandeur of the Catholic Church impossible to ignore or deny. They built it everywhere. The Church of St. Nicholas in the lesser town, whose great green dome is one of the most recognizable features of the Prague skyline. Palace after palace in the district below the castle, their facades competing in the extravagance of their ornamentation. The Strahov Monastery Library, with its extraordinary ceiling frescoes and walls of books from floor to gallery to ceiling. Here is what you need to understand when you stand in the most beautiful parts of Prague today. The churches and palaces that make the lesser town and the castle district so visually extraordinary are largely products of conquest, confiscation, and cultural suppression. The money that built them came from estates taken from Protestant families who were expelled or executed. The labour that raised their walls was provided by a population whose own cultural life was being systematically marginalised at the same time. The most beautiful parts of the city are monuments to one of the most thorough acts of cultural destruction in early modern European history. That is not a contradiction. In Prague, beauty and violence have always been part of the same story. The people who survived in Bohemia learned to live inside a paradox, outwardly compliant, because there was no other safe choice. Inwardly, something more complicated, a stubbornness built into the character of the place across 4 centuries of Hussite resistance that no amount of Baroque ornamentation could entirely reach or entirely cover. Prague had been silenced. It had not been erased. And 3 centuries later, in libraries and concert halls and small private gatherings where ideas circulate when public speech is constrained, the people of Bohemia were going to find a way to say so. Chapter 7. Baroque Silence. On an October evening in 1787, a composer sat in a carriage, moving through the streets of Prague's old town, and listened to the city singing his own music back at him. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart had arrived in Prague the previous year for the first time, bringing with him The Marriage of Figaro, an opera whose barely concealed argument about class and privilege the Viennese audience had received with polite indifference. Prague had responded with something entirely different. The opera had run continuously. Street vendors sold sheet music of the arias. People hummed the melodies in the markets. The city had understood what Vienna had chosen not to engage with, that Figaro's anger at aristocratic privilege, dressed in music of impossible beauty, was not merely entertainment, but something closer to a shared feeling made audible. Mozart wrote about the experience with a warmth he rarely expressed about any city. The biographer Franz Němeček, who knew Mozart personally and published his account in Prague in 1798, close enough to the events to be treated as a credible source, even if the exact wording of specific remarks cannot be independently verified, recorded Mozart as saying that his Praguers understood him in a way that his home audiences did not. Now he was back. The Prague impresario Pasquale Bondini had commissioned a new opera specifically for the Prague audience. Mozart had composed Don Giovanni, and tonight was its world premiere at what is now called the Stavovské divadlo, the Estates Theatre, on the 29th of October, 1787. That theatre still stands on the same spot in the old town. It is the only opera house in the world where Mozart himself conducted from a world premiere. When the film Amadeus was made in 1984, the production used it for sequences set in Vienna, because no Viennese building from the period survived in comparable condition, the city that Vienna largely ignored preserved, in its stones, the most intact physical record of what Mozart's world actually looked like. Think about what that says about Prague in this period, a city whose official culture had been reorganized by force for a century and a half, whose Czech-speaking population had been pushed out of official and elite life, whose Protestant intellectual tradition had been suppressed and burned, had somehow maintained enough cultural vitality, enough emotional intelligence, enough capacity for genuine response, to recognize genius that its more celebrated neighbor had missed. The suppression had gone very deep, but it had not gone all the way down. This is the paradox at the heart of the Baroque period in Prague. The decades after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 brought stability, of a kind, not a free stability, not a willing stability, the stability of a population exhausted by catastrophe that had made its accommodations with the new reality and was learning to live within it. The Counter-Reformation had done its work. The Protestant churches were gone or driven underground. The Czech-speaking nobility had been replaced. The educational system was in the hands of the Jesuits. And the city, paradoxically, grew more beautiful with every passing decade. The Habsburg emperors who came after Ferdinand II continued to invest in Prague as the capital of the Kingdom of Bohemia, the wealthiest single territory in the Habsburg holdings. Tax revenues from Bohemian silver and Bohemian agriculture funded wars and courts across the empire, and some portion of that wealth came back to Prague in the form of palaces and churches and the administrative infrastructure of a major provincial capital. The Wallenstein Palace, built in the 1620s for Albrecht von Wallenstein, the Habsburg military commander who became one of the most powerful individuals in Central Europe, was so large that its construction required the demolition of an entire neighborhood of houses to make space for it. The Wallenstein Garden, still open to the public today, contains bronze sculptures of mythological figures and a grotto of artificial stalactites along one wall. It was built at the height of the 30 Years' War. The gap between the suffering of the people of Bohemia during those decades and the scale of investment in a private garden for their military commander is not a gap that requires historical commentary. It speaks for itself. Wallenstein himself did not survive his own power. He was killed in 1634 at Cheb in western Bohemia, on what the historical consensus treats as implicit imperial authorization. He had become too powerful to be tolerated by the emperor he served. He is buried in the church he had built on his palace grounds in the lesser town, which you can visit today. His story has the quality that Prague stories tend to have: enormous ambition, enormous achievement, and a violent end that came from the direction he least expected. Prague under Baroque was a city of tremendous visual culture and almost no political life. The structures that had made Bohemia constitutionally distinct had been destroyed after White Mountain. What remained was the administered order of a Habsburg province, governed efficiently and with considerable investment, but governed from outside by people whose primary loyalty was to Vienna. Czech had been pushed out of official life. German was the language of the educated, the commercial, the institutional. To be a Czech speaker in 18th century Prague was, with limited exceptions, to be someone without access to the structures that governed your life. But what the Mozart evenings at the Estates Theatre revealed was something the administrators and the censors had not reached. The inner life of the city, the capacity for response that no amount of institutional reorganization could entirely extinguish. The Czech audience that packed the theatre to hear Don Giovanni was not a passive population receiving what their Habsburg overlords approved. It was a cultivated, emotionally alive community responding to something real with its full intelligence. And outside the theatre, in the libraries and the universities and the small private gatherings where ideas circulate when public speech is constrained, a different kind of work was beginning. The Czech national revival, as historians call it, started not as a political movement, but as a scholarly and cultural one. A generation of Czech intellectuals, working from the late 18th century onward, began the patient and unglamorous task of recovering and revitalizing a language and a cultural tradition that had been pushed to the margins for a century and a half. Joseph Dobrovský was a Jesuit-educated priest who published the first systematic grammar of the Czech language in 1792, a foundational act of linguistic scholarship that treated Czech as a language worthy of serious formal description at a time when its official status suggested otherwise. Josef Jungmann compiled a comprehensive Czech-German dictionary over decades of sustained work. František Palacký began writing the first serious history of Bohemia, written in Czech, which was itself a declaration. To write the history of a people in their own language, at a time when that language had been excluded from every official document, was to insist on something that the surrounding institutional world was actively trying to deny. For American listeners, consider a comparison. Imagine that a conquering power had spent a century and a half systematically removing English from every institution that mattered, replacing it in schools, courts, government, commerce, and publishing with another language. And then imagine a generation of scholars deciding, quietly and without official support, to write down the grammar, compile the dictionary, recover the literature, and hand the language back to the people it belonged to. That is what was happening in Prague in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Not as drama, not as revolution, as patient, methodical, unglamorous scholarly work that most of the people around them considered eccentric at best. The music of the period carried the same current. Czech folk themes began entering the concert halls. The emerging distinctiveness of what would become a recognizably Czech musical tradition, one that would eventually produce Dvorak and Smetana in the following century, was separating itself from the German and Austrian styles that had dominated for a century. These scholars were not, in most cases, political nationalists. They were academics and writers doing intellectual work they believed mattered. But the work they were doing was planting something. The language they were recovering would become, within 2 generations, the vehicle of demands not just for cultural recognition but for something far larger. The Baroque silence was ending, not with a declaration, not with a march, with a grammar book, a dictionary, and a history written in the language that the empire had decided belonged only to the past. What came next would not stay quiet for long. The Baroque silence was ending, not with a declaration, not with a march, with a grammar book, a dictionary, and a history written in the language that the empire had decided belonged only to the past. What came next would not stay quiet for long. Chapter 8. The Republic and the Miracle. There is a photograph taken in Prague on the 28th of October, 1918, that captures a moment the city had not experienced in 300 years. The streets are crowded with people, the faces turned toward the camera are not frightened. They are not cautious. They are something rarer in Czech history than almost anything else. They are joyful. On that day, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed after 4 years of the most destructive war in human history, and Czechoslovakia was declared an independent state. The announcement was made in Wenceslas Square, the long boulevard in the new town that Karol IV had built as a horse market 5.5 centuries earlier, and that had become, over those centuries, the place where Czech history came to its most significant public moments. Crowds filled the square for hours. People who had spent their entire lives as subjects of an empire that had suppressed their political identity and pushed their language out of official life were suddenly, incomprehensibly, citizens of their own country. To understand what was built in Prague between 1918 and 1938, you need to understand the man who built it. Thomas Garrigue Masaryk was 68 years old when Czechoslovakia was declared. He was a philosopher, a sociologist, a professor, a politician, and a man whose moral seriousness shaped every practical decision he made. He had spent the war years in Paris, London, Washington, and Moscow, arguing for Czechoslovak independence with a persistence and intellectual rigor that eventually persuaded the Allied powers that a stable democratic state in the heart of Central Europe was in their interest. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points gave Masaryk the diplomatic leverage he needed. He modelled the republic he built on 2 things he admired above all others: the democratic traditions of Britain and France, and the political philosophy of Abraham Lincoln, whom he revered without reservation. The historian Peter Bugge, whose research on Masaryk's political thought has been published in the journal Nationalities Papers, documented this admiration extensively, showing how Masaryk returned again and again to Lincoln as the example of a leader who held a divided nation together through crisis without abandoning the principles it was founded on. Masaryk wanted to do the same thing for a country that was, from the first day of its existence, profoundly divided. Czechoslovakia was ethnically plural in a way that would have challenged any statesman. Its population included Czechs, Slovaks, Germans, Hungarians, Ukrainians, and the Jewish community that had been part of the Bohemian landscape for centuries. The Sudeten Germans, the German-speaking population living primarily in the border regions of Bohemia and Moravia, numbered over 3 million people with their own political culture and their own complex feelings about living in a state that named itself after the Slavic majority. Masaryk's answer to this diversity was not to suppress it, but to build institutional structures strong enough to contain it. Parliamentary democracy, an independent judiciary, press freedom that was, by the standards of interwar Europe, remarkable. Religious freedom that protected both the Catholic tradition and the various Protestant and Jewish communities throughout the country. The result was a republic that stood out from its neighbours in ways that contemporaries noticed and that historians have continued to study. While Germany fell to fascism, while Hungary moved toward authoritarianism, while Poland's democracy weakened, Czechoslovakia maintained its democratic institutions through the entire interwar period. This was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate construction by a man and a generation of leaders who understood that democracy was not a gift, but a practice requiring constant maintenance. Prague in the 1920s and 1930s was the city of this republic, and it showed. The modernist architecture of the period is among the most accomplished in the European tradition. Less famous than its counterparts in Germany or the Netherlands, but often their equal in quality. The city built new apartment blocks, new public buildings, New institutions with the confidence of a society that believed it had a future. The cultural life of this period was extraordinary. Karel Čapek, whose science fiction plays and novels introduced the word robot into every language on Earth, was writing and working in Prague throughout the 20s and 30s. He was a close friend of Masaryk and the kind of public intellectual that healthy democracies produce when their institutions are working. A man who could say complicated things about technology and humanity and politics to a broad public that trusted him enough to engage seriously with the ideas. And then there was Franz Kafka. Kafka was born in Prague in 1883, the son of a German-speaking Jewish merchant. He spent his entire life in Prague, working in insurance by day and writing at night, with a dedication so intense and a self-criticism so severe that he burned most of what he produced, and instructed his friend Max Brod to burn the rest after his death. Brod did not. He published it instead. The Trial, The Castle, The Metamorphosis, all of it written by a man who never lived anywhere but Prague, who wrote in German about a world that often looks like Prague reinterpreted as nightmare. Kafka died in 1924 of tuberculosis, in a sanatorium near Vienna. He did not see what was coming, but literary scholars, including Ritchie Robertson, whose study of Kafka, published by Oxford University Press in 2004, remains one of the most thorough in the English language, have long argued that Kafka's work describes the experience of the individual confronting arbitrary institutional power with a precision that makes it feel like prophecy. That bureaucratic menace, that sense of guilt without a specified charge, that system which operates according to rules no one will explain and produces outcomes no one intended. All of it was coming to Europe within a decade of his death. Adolf Hitler had come to power in Germany in 1933. The Sudeten German population of Czechoslovakia provided the mechanism his ambitions required. By 1938, the Sudeten German Party, funded and directed from Berlin, was making demands designed not to be met, but to provide a pretext for German intervention. In September of 1938, the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy met in Munich. Czechoslovakia was not invited to the conference that decided its fate. The Sudetenland was handed to Germany in exchange for Hitler's assurance that he had no further territorial demands. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to London with a piece of paper and announced that he had secured peace for our time. In Prague, the people who understood what had happened gathered in the streets and wept, not from fear alone, though fear was present, from something that the Czech experience of history gave them a precise vocabulary for. They had a name for this. They had felt it before. At White Mountain in 1620, in the decades of Baroque suppression that followed, at every point in their history when the fate of their country had been decided by larger powers in rooms they were not allowed to enter. Betrayal. Edvard Beneš resigned and went into exile. The rump state that remained after Munich was absorbed entirely by Germany in March of 1939. When German troops marched into Prague without a shot being fired, Hitler came to Prague Castle the following morning and slept there. He gave a speech from a window to a city that watched in silence. The 20 years between 1918 and 1938 are sometimes called the First Republic, the period of the miracle that Masaryk built. The institutions functioned. The courts were independent. The press was free. The citizens could vote, and their votes counted. For 20 years, in a Europe that was choosing authoritarianism with frightening regularity, Prague chose something different. That choice was taken away from outside, but the memory of having made it was not. And before the occupation was over, the city that had just watched foreign troops march through its streets without resistance would produce an act of resistance so precise, so dangerous, and so consequential that it would change the course of the war. Chapter 9. Occupation and the Assassination. There is a village in the Czech Republic called Lidice. It sits about 15 miles northwest of Prague, in the gentle rolling landscape of the Bohemian countryside. It is a quiet place. There is a museum and a memorial and a rose garden that contains rose bushes donated by cities from 30 countries around the world. There is a wall with names on it. There is a sculpture of children. There is no original village. Not a single building remains. To understand why Lidice does not exist anymore, you need to go back to a morning in May of 1942 and a sharp curve in a road in the Prague suburb of Kobylisi, and a man named Reinhard Heydrich sitting in an open-topped car. Heydrich was one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich and one of the most dangerous individuals in Europe. As Deputy Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, he was responsible for the governance of a territory of 7 million people. He was, by the assessment of his contemporaries and by the historical evidence, brilliant, methodical, physically imposing, and utterly without mercy. He was known to the Czech population as the Butcher of Prague. In the months after his appointment in September of 1941, he had organized the suppression of Czech resistance with an efficiency that reflected his talent for systematic violence. Resistance networks were penetrated and destroyed. Key figures were arrested, tried before special courts, and executed. The pace and precision of the crackdown reduced the resistance's operational capacity significantly. He was also, in January of 1942, the man who chaired the Wannsee Conference, the meeting in a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, at which senior Nazi officials coordinated the implementation of what they called the final solution to the Jewish question, the systematic murder of every Jewish person in Europe. The minutes of that conference, preserved in their entirety and entered as evidence at the Nuremberg trials, record the discussion with a bureaucratic precision that has made them one of the most chilling documents in recorded history. 11 million people were discussed as an administrative problem to be solved. Heydrich ran the meeting. The Czech government in exile, operating from London under Beneš, decided that Heydrich needed to be killed. The operation was called Anthropoid. 2 Czech paratroopers, Josef Gabčík and Jan Hus, were trained by British Special Operations Forces and parachuted into Bohemia in December of 1941. They spent months making contact with the resistance and preparing the assassination. Heydrich drove an open car from his residence to Prague Castle each morning without armoured escort, apparently believing that he was so feared by the Czech population that no one would dare to act against him. He was wrong. On the morning of the 27th of May, 1942, Gabčík and Hus waited at the curve in the road in Kobylisi, where Heydrich's car would have to slow down. When the car approached, Gabčík stepped into the road and raised his Sten submachine gun. It jammed. Heydrich stood up in the car to shoot at Gabčík. At that moment, Hus threw a modified anti-tank grenade that exploded against the rear of the car. Shrapnel and fragments penetrated Heydrich's body. He staggered out of the car and attempted to pursue Gabčík before collapsing. He was taken to a hospital in Prague and died on the 4th of June of septicemia from his wounds. The Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia was dead. It was the highest-ranking assassination of a Nazi official carried out during the entire war. The reprisals were immediate and designed not merely to punish but to terrorize. An informer eventually revealed that the paratroopers were hiding with other resistance members in the crypt of the Cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius in the new town of Prague. On the 18th of June, 1942. The cathedral was surrounded by approximately 700 SS troops, according to post-war historical research on the operation. The paratroopers and their colleagues fought from the crypt for several hours. The SS attempted to flood the crypt through fire hoses inserted through a window. The defenders tried to block it. When the position became untenable, the survivors took their own lives rather than surrender. You can visit that crypt today. The marks of the bullets are still in the walls. They have been left exactly as they were found. And then came Unease. German intelligence had developed a connection between the village of Unease and members of the resistance network. The decision made in Berlin in response was not investigative. It was demonstrative. On the 10th of June, 1942, German forces surrounded Unease. All men and boys over 15 years old. 173 people were shot. The women, 184 of them, were sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where over half died. Of the children, 88 were taken away. Most were killed in gas vans. A small number deemed racially suitable for Germanization were removed to German families. Then the village was burned. Then the ruins were dynamited. Then the rubble was cleared away. Then the site was bulldozed. Then it was covered with soil. Stop there. Read that sequence again slowly. Burned, dynamited, rubble cleared, bulldozed, covered with soil. The German intention was not to destroy a village. It was to make the village cease to have ever existed. Not just the people, not just the buildings, the place itself, the ground on which it stood, the name on any map. It did not work. Within days of the destruction, the name Unease was known throughout the world. The British government publicized it immediately. Towns and villages across the Allied world renamed themselves Unease in solidarity. Stern Park Gardens in Illinois became Unease. Illinois. San Geronimo Aculco in Mexico changed its name. Mining communities in Britain. Cities in Brazil. Villages in the Soviet Union. The intention behind all of it was to say in the most direct possible way that a name cannot be erased by destroying the ground it grew from. The more thoroughly you try to erase a name, sometimes, the more permanently you fix it in the memory of everyone watching. The Holocaust in Bohemia and Moravia followed the pattern established across occupied Europe: organized, systematic, and thorough. The Jewish community of Prague, one of the oldest and most significant in Europe, was deported to the Terezin ghetto north of Prague, which served simultaneously as a showcase designed to deceive international observers and as a transit point to the death camps in Poland. Of the approximately 90,000 Jews living in the Protectorate at the time of occupation, fewer than 10,000 survived the war. The Pinkas Synagogue in Prague's Josefov Quarter has the names of 77,297 Bohemian and Moravian Jewish Holocaust victims inscribed on its walls. Every wall, every surface, the names of the dead covering every space available. Written by hand in the years after the war. Stand in that building and let yourself understand what the names are. Not a decoration, not an architectural choice, a record of specific people who lived in this city and in the towns and villages around it, who had families and addresses and jobs and lives, and who were murdered. It is one of the most profound experiences available in any building in Europe, and it is there because the people who came after made the decision that the names would not be lost, even though the people themselves were. The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May, 1945. Prague was liberated, but the questions of who would govern it, and on whose terms, were not yet answered. 2.5 years later, in the February cold of 1948? Those questions would be answered in ways that no one who had survived the occupation had fought for, and the first sign of what was coming would appear, as it so often had in the history of this city, at a window. Chapter 10. The Coup and the Iron Curtain. On the morning of the 10th of March, 1948, a man named Jan Masaryk was found dead in the courtyard of the Chernin Palace in Prague. He had fallen from a window of his apartment on the 3rd floor. He was the son of Thomas Masaryk, the founder of the Republic. He had served as foreign minister of the democratic government. He was the last non-communist minister to have held office in the Czechoslovak cabinet. The official conclusion was suicide. It has been contested ever since. A formal reopened inquiry by Czech investigators in the 1990s examined the physical evidence and pointed toward murder. The case has never been conclusively closed. Whether Jan Masaryk jumped or was thrown, the manner of his death completed a pattern the city had seen before. A man who represented something the new power found inconvenient. Going through a window in Prague, but this time there was no surviving and no debate about miracles. Only a body in a courtyard, and a question that Prague has never been able to fully answer. He died 2 weeks after the coup that had changed everything. What happened in Czechoslovakia in February of 1948 happened fast, and it was designed to happen fast. The Communist Party had won approximately 38% of the vote in the 1946 elections, the highest result any Communist Party achieved in a free election in any European country in the post-war period. Clement Gottwald became Prime Minister within a coalition government, but by 1948, the Cold War was crystallizing. Stalin's Soviet Union was consolidating its control over the states of Eastern Europe, and the Czechoslovak communists, with Soviet backing, moved to convert their democratic participation into something else entirely. The crisis began with a dispute over the police. The Communist Interior Minister was replacing non-communist regional police commanders with party loyalists. Non-communist ministers resigned from the cabinet to force a political crisis they believed they could win. They miscalculated. Gottwald used the crisis to consolidate communist control rather than resolve it. The people's militias, armed workers, units loyal to the party, occupied strategic points across Prague. Soviet military movements along the Czechoslovak border communicated what the alternative to compliance would look like. President Edvard Beneš, ill and exhausted, and having spent his political life trying to prevent catastrophe through accommodation with larger powers, accepted the new communist government. The coup was complete in days. Jan Masaryk remained as foreign minister, the one non-communist in the new cabinet, perhaps as a gesture of continuity, perhaps for other reasons that are now impossible to determine. On the 10th of March, 2 weeks after the coup, he was found dead in the courtyard below his window. He was 60 years old. What followed was the systematic transformation of Czechoslovakia into a Soviet-style state, the nationalization of private enterprise, the collectivization of agriculture, the reorganization of the legal system, the educational system, the cultural institutions, all along the lines of the Soviet model. The secret police, the STB, built a surveillance apparatus that penetrated Czech society at every level, with networks of informers that subsequent historical research, including work by Czech historians who gained access to the STB archives after 1989, found touching almost every significant institution in the country. The show trials that began in the early 1950s went beyond the suppression of political opposition. They consumed the party itself. Rudolf Slansky, the Communist Party General Secretary and one of the architects of the February coup. He was arrested in 1951, tried in 1952 on charges of conspiracy and treason, and executed along with 10 other defendants. The trial had significant anti-Semitic dimensions, with several defendants who were Jewish identified explicitly by their backgrounds in ways that echoed broader patterns elsewhere in the Soviet bloc at the time. Prague in the 1950s was a city of extraordinary surface, calm and extraordinary internal tension. The buildings were still there, the Baroque palaces and the Gothic towers and the medieval streets, unchanged by the political reorganization happening inside them. But the life inside had changed completely. Intellectuals, artists, academics, anyone with connections to the West or to the pre-communist world, found themselves unemployable in their professions, relocated to provincial towns or factory work, or imprisoned. The castle on the hill had always been a symbol of whoever held power in Bohemia. Under the communists, it remained so. Gottwald moved in. The red flag flew from its towers. The city that Jan Hus had preached in, that Carroll had rebuilt, that Kafka had walked through, was now the capital of a state that described itself as the vanguard of human history and operated in practice as a police state with an excellent architectural inheritance. And then, slowly, things began to shift. Stalin died in March of 1953. The process that followed his death was slow and uneven and repeatedly reversed. But the direction over the subsequent decade was toward a partial acknowledgement of what Stalinism had done and a cautious opening of political space. In Czechoslovakia, this process was slower than in some other Soviet bloc countries, partly because the party leadership that emerged from the purges of the early 50s had every reason to be conservative about any change that might implicate them in what had preceded it. But the social pressures were real and they were growing. A generation of young people had grown up inside the communist system and were educated enough to see its contradictions clearly. The cultural journals and literary magazines permitted to exist under censorship became spaces where writers pushed carefully against the boundaries of what was allowed. The boundaries moved, fractionally, year by year, through the 1960s. By 1967 and 68, the pressure had reached the party itself. Alexander Dubček was not a rebel. He was a party man, a Slovak communist who had worked within the system his entire career. But he believed, genuinely, that socialism could be reformed, that a system responsive to human needs and compatible with basic freedoms was achievable within the Soviet framework. He became first secretary of the Communist Party in January of 1968, and the program he announced became known. In a phrase his communications director is generally credited with coining, as socialism with a human face. The censorship was lifted. The press became, within weeks, one of the freest in Europe. Public discussion of the crimes of the Stalinist period began openly for the first time. The rehabilitation of the victims of the show trials proceeded. Travel restrictions were loosened. Political prisoners were released. Civic organizations proliferated across the country. The speed of it was astonishing. Within a few months, Czechoslovakia had gone from one of the most rigid communist states to one of the most open political environments in Europe, and the people of Prague were in the streets. Not in protest, but in something rarer and more fragile than protest. In genuine enthusiasm for what seemed to be happening, the Soviets watched. On the night of the 20th to the 21st of August, 1968, Warsaw Pact forces entered Czechoslovakia. The invasion involved approximately 500,000 troops and thousands of tanks from the Soviet Union. East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria, one of the largest military operations in Europe since the end of the Second World War, directed against a country that had given no military provocation whatsoever, and whose only offence was attempting to govern itself with a degree of openness that the Soviet leadership found intolerable. Czechoslovakia did not fight back militarily. There was resistance of a different kind. Civilians stood in front of tanks on the streets of Prague. Young people argued with soldiers who had been told they were coming to defend Czechoslovakia against a West German invasion and were confronted instead by Czech civilians telling them the truth in Russian. Radio stations broadcast continuously until their transmitters were seized one by one. Street signs across the city were removed or turned to point in wrong directions, making it harder for the invaders to navigate. A young man named Jan Palach was 19 years old when the invasion happened. He was a student at Charles University. On the 16th of January, 1969, he went to Wenceslas Square, poured petrol over himself, and set himself on fire. He died 3 days later from his burns. His stated intention was to protest the normalization that was already extinguishing what the Prague Spring had briefly made possible, and to call on his fellow Czechs not to accept what was being done to their country in silence. Hundreds of thousands of people attended his funeral. His name was suppressed by the authorities in the years that followed. His grave marked under a false name, because the power of what he had done was obvious to everyone, including those trying to erase it. But suppression did not work. The name moved through the city in the way names move when authorities are afraid of them. Everywhere, in whispers that were louder than any official announcement. What followed was called normalization. The reforms of the Prague Spring were systematically reversed. The press was recensored. The civic organizations were dissolved. Dubček was expelled from the party and spent the normalization period working as a forestry official in Slovakia. His name removed from official records and public discourse as completely as the authorities could manage. The writer Václav Havel, a playwright whose work had been performed internationally before the invasion but was banned in Czechoslovakia afterward, described what normalization meant in practice in an essay called The Power of the Powerless, published in 1978 and circulated in typed copies passed from hand to hand across the country and across the Soviet bloc. He described a greengrocer who displays a Communist Party slogan in his window. Not because he believes it, but because displaying it is what is required, and not displaying it would attract attention he cannot afford. The greengrocer is not a true believer. He is someone who has learned to manage the gap between what he thinks and what he is permitted to say. Havel argued that this management of the gap corrupted everyone who practiced it, because it required complicity in a lie they knew was a lie, and that complicity accumulated over years into something like the slow destruction of the self. Havel was arrested. He spent years in prison. He kept writing. The normalization years lasted 20 years. Prague maintained its surface calm. The tourists came because Prague was extraordinarily beautiful, and the beauty was real regardless of what was happening inside it. The Baroque towers and the medieval bridges and the castle on the hill functioned as they always had, indifferent to the political arrangements of the people living among them. Underneath the surface, something was waiting, and across the border in Poland, in Hungary, in East Germany, the system that had seemed permanent was beginning, in the autumn of 1989, to show the first signs that nothing built on a lie lasts forever. Chapter 11. Velvet and Freedom. There is a date that every Czech person of a certain age carries in their memory with the precision that people carry the dates of things that changed everything. The 17th of November, 1989. To understand what happened on that date, You need to understand what had been happening in the rest of the Soviet bloc in the months before it. Poland had held partially free elections in June, and the Solidarity movement had won decisively. Hungary had opened its border with Austria in September, allowing East Germans to flow west in numbers that began the chain of events, ending with the Berlin Wall falling on the 9th of November. East Germany was in open upheaval. The system that had seemed not just permanent but structurally inevitable was coming apart at a speed that was disorienting even to those who had been working toward it for decades. In Czechoslovakia, the Communist Party was watching what was happening in neighbouring countries and hoping that things would remain quiet at home. The party was wrong. The 17th of November was the 50th anniversary of the Nazi suppression of Czech student protests in 1939, a date already charged with historical meaning. A student demonstration was organised to mark the occasion. It was officially permitted. The students assembled and marched. The demonstration remained peaceful until security forces blocked the route and then charged the crowd. Hundreds of students were beaten. A rumour spread across Prague that night that a student had been killed in the violence. The rumour turned out to be false, but it spread before it could be corrected. And it did what rumours do in closed societies where official information has lost all credibility. It ignited everything. The following days saw demonstrations that grew larger with each successive evening. Tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, gathering on Wenceslas Square. The sound of keys jingling filled the square each evening, people holding up their key rings and shaking them together. A sound that said, in the gentlest possible way, that time was up, that it was time to go home. Pause on that image. Not guns, not barricades, not the burning of buildings. Keys. The sound of hundreds of thousands of people shaking their keys in the cold November air. A people who had survived the suppression after White Mountain, the Baroque silence, the Nazi occupation, the communist coup, and a Soviet-led military invasion, choosing in the moment of their final confrontation with the system that had imprisoned their country for 40 years to shake their keys. There is a kind of courage in that gentleness that is harder to understand than the courage of violence, and in some ways harder to achieve. The Civic Forum, the broad coalition of opposition groups that formed within days of the 17th of November, chose as its spokesperson a man who had been in prison, whose plays could not be performed in his own country, who had spent 20 years being prosecuted by a government that understood exactly what he represented and was afraid of it. Václav Havel stood on a balcony above Wenceslas Square, and the crowd below him was so large that the sound of it carried far beyond the square itself. He was not a general. He was not a party official. He was not a professional politician. He was a playwright, small, somewhat rumpled, visibly uncertain about the scale of what was happening around him, and completely certain about what needed to happen next. The communist government attempted to negotiate. It tried to offer reforms within the party framework. The crowds in the square, night after night, made clear with the patience of people who had been lied to for 20 years and were not going to be lied to one more time, that reforms within the party framework were not what was being asked for. On the 24th of November, 1989, Alexander Dubček appeared on the same balcony as Havel, the man whose reform program the Soviet tanks had destroyed 21 years earlier, standing beside the man who had kept the resistance alive through the long silence that followed. The crowd recognized Dubček immediately. The sound that rose from Wenceslas Square when they saw him is one of those moments that, when you encounter it in the historical record, resists easy description. It was not simply joy. It was something more complicated. The release of something that had been held for a very long time, finally allowed to move. The communist government resigned on the 24th of November. Negotiations over the transition to democracy proceeded through December. On the 29th of December, 1989, Václav Havel was elected president of Czechoslovakia by the Federal Assembly. The man who had been in prison for writing the truth was now in Prague Castle. He stood at the window of the castle that Bořivoj had built above the river bend in the 9th century, and looked out over the city that Carroll had remade in the 14th century, that Hus had preached in, and Kafka had walked through, and Heydrich had terrorized, and the Prague Spring had briefly made joyful, and the Soviet tanks had silenced. And he gave a speech that has been translated into most of the languages of the world. He said that the people of Czechoslovakia had not deserved the decades they had lived through. He said that truth and love would prevail over lies and hate, even if that prevailing sometimes required a very long time. 17 days. From the 17th of November to the 4th of December, when the first non-communist dominated government in 41 years was formed. A system that had held power for 4 decades, swept away by crowds shaking their keys in the November cold. The Velvet Revolution. The name came from the quality of the transition itself. Bloodless. Rapide. Conducted with a humour and a civility that astonished observers from countries where power had never changed hands this way. The dismantling of the system that followed was complex and imperfect in the way that all such transitions are. The secret police files. The documentation of 40 years of surveillance and informants and compromised lives had to be managed in ways that allowed people to learn what had been done without simply consuming the society in recrimination. The economic transition from central planning to a market economy required decisions that had no clear right answers and consequences that fell unevenly. The collaborative structures of the opposition period, which had functioned brilliantly as resistance, did not automatically translate into the different and less morally clear role of governance. And then there was Slovakia. The tension between the Czech lands and Slovakia had been present since the founding of the state in 1918. 2 nations sharing a state with different languages, different historical experiences, different economies, and different relationships with the communist period. The negotiations over what the post-communist state would look like surfaced these differences in ways that proved, despite considerable effort, irresolvable within the existing framework. The decision to separate was made by political leaders rather than by popular referendum, which has been controversial. The political scientist Valerie Bunce, whose comparative research on post-communist transitions has been widely cited in the academic literature on this period, documented how survey data from both the Czech lands and Slovakia at the time showed majority preferences for maintaining a shared state. But the negotiations reached a point where the leaders on both sides concluded that an agreed separation was preferable to a contested continuation. On the 1st of January, 1993, Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. The Czech Republic and Slovakia became independent states. The transition was so orderly, so thoroughly negotiated, so free of the violence that had accompanied almost every other national separation in European history, that it acquired its own name, the Velvet Divorce. One revolution without blood, one separation without tears, within 4 years, in a country that had experienced 3 centuries of occupation and 2 different forms of totalitarian rule within living memory. Prague became the capital of the Czech Republic. The castle on the hill was still there. Charles Bridge was still there. The Baroque churches of the lesser town were still there. And the city that had been closed to most of the world for 40 years was about to open in ways that no one had entirely anticipated or planned for. Chapter 12. The City That Never Finished Becoming. In the years immediately after the Velvet Revolution, Something happened to Prague that its residents are still trying to fully understand. The world arrived. Not gradually. Not in the measured way that cities usually absorb new attention, but all at once and with an intensity that the city's infrastructure, its institution, its housing stock, its sense of itself, had not been designed to handle. The backpackers came first, drawn by exchange rates that made Prague extraordinarily cheap, and by a romantic idea of a city emerging from behind the Iron Curtain into the light. Then the investors came. Seeing a Central European location with an educated workforce and costs well below Western European levels. Then the corporations came. Then the tour groups. Then the boutique hotels and the craft beer bars and the short-term rental listings and the bachelor party organizers and the food tour companies and the astronomical clock crowd that gathers on the hour. Every hour. From 8 in the morning until 10 at night. To watch a medieval mechanism perform the same routine it has been performing since 1410. Prague had always been beautiful. What had changed was access. Under communism, the relative isolation of the years 1948 to 1989 had one consequence that no one planned for. It had preserved the city. The urban renewal projects that had dramatically altered the historic centres of Western European cities in the post-war decades, the demolitions and ring roads and modernist insertions that changed the texture of Munich and Rotterdam and Birmingham, had not happened in Prague. The medieval street plan was intact. The Baroque facades were intact. The Gothic towers were intact. The Art Nouveau apartment buildings of the late 19th century were intact, their details weathered but not removed. When the city opened, what it revealed was one of the most intact historic centres of any capital city in Central Europe, a place that looked, in many parts of the old city, more like the 19th century than the 21st. The numbers that followed tell a straightforward story. By the mid-2000s, Prague was receiving 5 million tourists annually. By 2015, approaching 10 million. By 2019, the last full year before the global pandemic disrupted travel, the Prague City Tourism Organization documented approximately 8 million visitors to a city of 1.3 million people. In the most concentrated areas of the historic centre, particularly around Old Town Square, Charles Bridge, and the castle approach, the ratio of visitors to residents on a summer afternoon is difficult to calculate, precisely because the residents have largely stopped going there. The complaints from Prague residents about the transformation of their city are by this point extensively documented and familiar in their broad outlines. The cafe tables in Old Town Square that once served local residents at prices local residents could afford now primarily serve visitors at prices calibrated to Western European purchasing power. The apartments that once housed working-class Prague families have been converted, building by building, into short-term rentals. The souvenir shops multiply. The prices rise. The long-time residents move further out. But in Prague, these complaints carry a particular edge that they do not carry in Venice or Amsterdam or Barcelona, and it is worth understanding why. The city that tourists are consuming was preserved in part by the very isolation that the Czech people spent 40 years trying to escape. The beauty that draws millions of visitors a year is inseparable from the suppression that kept the city from being redeveloped. There is something painful in that logic that goes beyond the usual complaints about over-tourism. The price of freedom, in Prague's case, included the opening of your city to a kind of attention that changes what made it worth visiting in the first place. The language question has returned in a different form. In the 17th century, Czech was pushed out of official and elite life in favour of German. In the communist period, Russian was the prestige foreign language of the institutions. Now English dominates the commercial centre of Prague so completely that it is possible to spend days in the tourist zone without hearing Czech spoken at all. The people of Prague are not forbidden to speak Czech in their own city. They simply increasingly do not need to in the spaces that visitors occupy. The language that Josef Dobrovský wrote a grammar for in 1792, that Joseph Jungmann compiled a dictionary for over decades of patient work, that survived Baroque suppression and communist reorganization, now competes with English for presence in its own historic centre. The Josefov Quarter, the former Jewish ghetto of Prague, is one of the most visited areas of the city. Its synagogues are among the best preserved examples of their kind in Europe. They exist in their current form because the Nazis who murdered the Jewish community of Prague also preserved its physical artifacts, intending to create what they described as a museum of an extinct race. The irony of the most complete Jewish museum in Central Europe, existing because its destroyers wanted to document the destruction, is one of the darker notes in a city that has learned to carry a great deal of darkness alongside its beauty. The community those buildings were built to serve is largely gone. The Jewish population of Prague before the Second World War numbered approximately 90,000. Today it is estimated at several thousand. The buildings stand. The people who built them and prayed in them and lived around them are the names on the walls of the Pinkas Synagogue, 77,297 of them, inscribed by hand in the years after the war by people who understood that the names at least could not be taken. The memorial to the victims of communism, installed on the slope of Petrin Hill in 2002, is a series of bronze figures descending a staircase, each figure more damaged and diminished than the one above it. The accumulation of what 40 years of a system designed to diminish people actually looked like when made visible. It stands in a location that most tourists pass on their way to other things. The Czech Republic has navigated the politics of the post-Velvet Revolution period with the difficulty that all new democracies experience, plus some that are specific to a country emerging from communist rule into a global economy that rewards some kinds of knowledge and some kinds of connection more than others. The transition produced both genuine reformers and people who used the chaos of privatization to accumulate wealth in ways that were not always straightforwardly legal. The political culture has oscillated between the civic tradition of Masaryk and Havel and a more nationalist and populist tendency that uses the memory of betrayal. Munich, 1948, 1968. As political fuel. Havel died on the 18th of December, 2011. His death produced a public outpouring that revealed how much he had meant, and how much what he had represented still mattered. Thousands gathered in Wenceslas Square, the place where the key-jingling crowds had shaken the communist system 32 years before, to leave flowers and candles, and to stand quietly in a space that had been the stage for the most important events of their national life. The square that Karel had built as a horse market in 1348, that Hus's followers had marched through in 1419, that the Czechoslovak Republic had been proclaimed in on the 28th of October, 1918, that the Soviet tanks had rolled past in 1968, that Havel and Dubček had spoken from in November of 1989, one boulevard, 700 years, the entire history of a people, held in the memory of a single public space. Prague, in 2026, is a city that is many things simultaneously. The capital of a stable European democracy with one of the lowest unemployment rates on the continent. A world-class tourist destination wrestling with the consequences of its own attractiveness. A city with a housing market increasingly inaccessible to the young Czechs who grew up here and would like to stay. A place of extraordinary architectural beauty that carries within it in the crosses embedded in the cobblestones of Old Town Square, in the bullet marks in the crypt walls of a church in the new town, in the names on the walls of a synagogue in Józefov, the precise and specific memory of what that beauty cost and who paid for it. It is also, still, a city on a hill above a river bend. The geography has not changed since the Slavic tribes first recognized its advantages in the 6th century. The Vltava still curves below the castle in the brown-green colour it always moves. The castle is still there on the cliff where Bořivoj built the first timber church in the 900s. Charles Bridge still spans the river at the point where crossing has been possible since long before anyone thought to write it down. In the early morning, before the tourists arrive, before the tour guides assemble their groups, before the first coffee shop on Mala Strana pulls back its shutters, Prague belongs to the river, the way it always has, the way it always will. This city has been ruled by the Habsburgs, occupied by the Nazis, and dominated by the Soviets. It has lost communities to murder and exile. It has had its language pushed out of the institutions that mattered, its leaders executed in its central square, its reformers crushed by tanks on its own streets. It has buried more than it should have had to bury, and it is still here, not unchanged, not without cost, but here, exactly where the geography always said it would be, doing what it has always done, carrying its history in its stones, surviving what comes, waiting for the light, the stones of Charles Bridge, laid by order of a Holy Roman Emperor who selected the date by the stars in 1357, are still exactly where he put them. They are not going anywhere.